But you're very welcome to week 4 of the course. And yeah, I've been really enjoying the course, I have to say. And we've been having team meetings beforehand. And I think we've all been really enjoying the course, and we've all been really enjoying the groups, I have to say as well. So yeah, well done, everyone. So we're a slightly diminished team tonight because two of our team can't make it. Kieran Kieran and Matthew can't make it tonight, so we'll be rearranging the groups ever so slightly, some of the groups, but I'll say more about that in a moment. To give you a sense of what we're going to do tonight, let me just start sharing my screen. So what we'll do tonight, we'll have a recap as usual of the home practice, of last week and the home practice. We'll do the home practice group, so you can talk about how you got on during the week. Tonight we're looking at wisdom, the wisdom perspective on the three jewels, and in the first half we're going to look at the nature of existence, which I've rather grandiosely called it. We'll do some reflection on that as usual. We'll have a 10-minute break, and then after the break we're going to look at the path to freedom, the path to wisdom, you could say. And one very traditional formulation of this is ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And then we'll do the home practice groups, and we'll look at the home practice, and we'll go back into groups, and of course just a chance for questions throughout as well if you have any. Yeah. Now, before I do the reminder of what we did last week, let's do a short meditation just to arrive. Yeah. So why don't we just set ourselves up so we're sitting comfortably? That can, you can be in your full meditation posture if you want it, but really, I think just being upright in a chair is enough. We'll be sitting for about 6 or 7 minutes. And if you just arrived, you're very welcome. We're just going to do a short set. Yeah, people are still arriving. So maybe this time we'll start by just tuning into the different senses. So when you're ready, closing your eyes, and just noticing, even with our eyes closed, what we can see. Not staring or forcing anything, but just noticing the patterns behind our eyelids, after effects of the light, after images, or just diffuse colors. And noticing then what we can hear. So being open to sounds and seeing if we can let the sounds come to us rather than going out to the sounds. It's just staying centered in ourselves as we listen, as we're open to what we can hear. And then opening to what we can smell, if we can smell anything. Maybe we can, maybe we can't smell much. Just patiently being with it anyway. And being open to what we can taste, if we can taste anything. Maybe the lingering taste of our dinner, of any food we had. It's not so important if we find anything or not. It's more just being open to our sense of taste. And being open then to our sense of touch, particularly our touch down in the body, out of the head where so much of the other senses are based. Maybe feeling the sense of touch, the sense of contact with the floor, with the cushions, with the chair. Becoming aware of our stomach and torso, stomach and abdomen and chest. And perhaps noticing the rise and fall of the rib cage as we breathe in and as we breathe out. The breath moving the body, moving the stomach, the abdomen, the chest, the throat. And with each out breath, just letting go that bit more into the support of your chair or cushions. And now noticing each in-breath, the body rising with each in-breath. And now letting go of the breath and letting go of all effort. And just sitting for the last few moments. Letting the mind do whatever it wants to do, but without adding any effort. And then when you're ready, starting to broaden out our awareness once more, taking in the sounds, this time actively going out to listen to them, having a sense of the room, the building, the surroundings. And when you're ready, then you can begin to reintroduce movement, wiggling fingers and toes. In your own time, opening your eyes and coming out of posture in whatever way you want. Okay, great. So that was just a little session to help us land and help us arrive. So let's just remind ourselves then, before we go into the groups, of what we did last week. So last week we looked at the 7 factors of enlightenment. The overarching theme last week was meditation. And I'll just remind us of these. I won't say much about each of these, but there was mindfulness, investigating, sorting out mental states, becoming aware of what was going on, basically, as you became more mindful. As you did that, you find energy was released. So having a sense of energy, a sense of energy in the body, in the mind. Experiencing then the joy of that energy, an enjoyment of meditation. And then finding that with that energy release, with that joy, we need to introduce an element of calm. So when we experience a lot of joy, it can be good after a point then to look out for calm in your experience and allow that calm to permeate you more. And then absorption or concentration, where we become so calm that we just become very absorbed in the mind, in the breath, in the object of meditation, and so on. And then out of that comes equanimity, a deep centeredness where the worldly winds can't blow us around. So and then we did a meditation. So we did the mindfulness of breathing. So that was the main practice we did last week. But obviously, quite a few of you have done the meditation course already. So you'll also know the loving kindness practice as well. So you could be doing that too. So the home practice, and this is the mindfulness of breathing, just to remind you, mindfulness of the breath with a count after the out breath, with a count before the in breath, just being mindful of the breath, and then the sensations as we breathe at the point of first contact. So the home practice then was to read chapter 3 of the book, continue to work with the worldly winds. So, we had those 4 ways of working with the worldly winds from the week before. And then that included the world going through the Dharma doors, and the other 3 ways. Let me just have to remind myself of them. So they were be aware of and name the worldly winds, distinguish control from influence, see the worldly winds as opportunities in terms of the Dharma doors, and be aware of the stories you tell yourself. Then meditate each day. So if you can, meditate each day. And then let people know how you're getting on Slack if you have the time. Yeah. Okay. So so that's the home practice. So what we'll do now is we'll go into groups. And just to say that, let me just get that in a form I can share in the Slack channel. Okay, sorry about that. I know my keyboard is very loud. So there's the home practice. So with the groups, Stephen will invite us to do the groups in a moment. But there's going to be, just because because Matthew and Kieran are away. So what we're going to do is, if you're in Matthew Blue Watch group, go to that group, okay? But if you're in Oscar Green Bells group, go to Matthew's group. So if you're in Oscar's group normally, go to is that right? Yeah, go to Matthew's group, yeah? So Stephen, maybe you could type this in the chat if that's okay, if you're not too... Okay, hang on, I think I've got this wrong. Hang on a second, let me just... Yeah, no, that's right so far. And then if you're in Kieran's group, you're going to go instead to Sam's group. Okay, so all you have to remember is that if you're in Oscar's group, you go to Matthew's group, and if you're in Kieran's group, you go to Sam's group. Yeah, Stephen, have I got that right? Is everything ready to go?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Good. And we'll go for 15 minutes. And when you're ready, you can set up those groups then and invite us to join. And if you're not sure, just hang around, or if something doesn't work, and Stephen will move you into the group you're in. Great. Seeing if this is an opportunity to talk about how you get on during the week, particularly with meditation and so on. Great. So if you click on the breakout rooms button at the bottom now, you'll see all the groups, so you can head to the groups. Okay. So I hope you had a good group. Oh, let me just click. Okay, great. As I was saying to my group, do let us know if you have any questions as well. You can type them in the chat. There's been very few questions on this course actually, which is maybe just because the groups have been really good, or maybe the material is really clear, or maybe we need to hear more from you guys, because it'd be great to have some questions as well. Teacher's great. Thanks, Irene. I was fishing for that one. I wasn't actually, but anyways, it's very nice to hear. Thank you. But anyways, no, don't be shy anyway if you have a question, and we'll see. We'll answer them. So often questions make the course. So what I want to look at now is the nature of existence, if I might be so arrogant as to try and tackle such an issue. So I want to talk about some general principles of sorry, let me just make sure I'm set up here correctly. Yeah, so I want to look at some general principles of the nature of existence, of basically what I mean by the nature of existence is what the Buddha said about, our experience of the world and what it's like. Yeah. Now, the first one of these is called conditionality. Now, some of you will have heard of this before, I'm sure. If you've read anything about Buddhism, you will have come across this. So this is the ever-flowing web of conditions. Yeah. So at the core of the Buddha's insight, at the core of the Buddha's enlightenment, is this idea of conditionality. So what this means is that everything that we experience has arisen independent upon conditions. Yeah. So all things happen. All the things that happen, we call them phenomena. You could say phenomena, or plural phenomenon. They arise because certain conditions have come together for that to arise. Yeah. So I was talking earlier about the. Let me just stop my sharing. So yeah, so I can see more of you. So thanks, Dara, for that question. So I was talking earlier about the sunflower seeds growing on our back window out here in the house, and they've become a bit battered in the hailstorms that have been going on during the week. So the conditions for those seeds to arise were that my housemate Declan planted them in some fertile soil. He regularly watered them. The temperature was warm enough that they would germinate, and that we had them in a place where they weren't going to get kicked over or walked on or whatever. So there's all these conditions that led to these sunflower plants starting to grow now. And he also has some tomato plants growing, and he also has some courgette plants growing, and some various other things. So there was a set of conditions that led to those things growing. Yeah. And but it's not just about flowers growing. So it's about everything we experience. So Vajragupta talked about in the book about how he is here in the world because his parents met in the 1950s. Yeah. And so he's there. He has arisen because his parents met in the 1950s. That's just one of the almost infinite number of conditions that have gone into him being there. And if his parents hadn't met in the 1950s, we wouldn't be here in this Zoom call having this course in this way. Yeah, we wouldn't have met, because maybe I would have ran a course, but it would have been a different course, because Vajragupta wouldn't have been around to write this book. Yeah. So even something as inconsequential as two people whose names we don't even know, and maybe you know Vajragupta's parents, I don't, meeting in the 1950s. So there's so many conditions that go into anything, and our birth was the nature of was the result of a vast network of conditions. Our death will be the result of a vast network of conditions. This course tonight, being here, sitting in this chair, is the result of a vast network of conditions. And if any of those conditions were different, this experience wouldn't be just as it is. So as Maggie said, it's very back to the future. But where does and if something was slightly different, if any of those conditions were different, well, so for example, I might not be here, or I might be here slightly differently. I might be sitting over here instead. You know what I mean? Or something like that. It might be a very small change. It might be a very big change. So you might say, well, so what? Yeah, so what? But when you look at it that way, when you look at all the conditions that led to, say, Vajrashura writing this book that has led to this course, if any of those conditions were different, this book might be different or might not be here. So it's so fragile, the web of conditions that have led us to being here, isn't it? If anything had been any way different, it would have been different. But where this is interesting then, and where the Buddha applied this then, is to our own states of mind and our own states of heart and our own states of being. So we get into stories, for example, about how we are or what's happening to us. And, we get into all kinds of ideas about how solid things are, like how solid our own ineptitude is, or how bad a person we are, or how a particular state of mind that we're in right now is so permanent and fixed and will be always with us. Like we're feeling grumpy now, and we just get into stories about how we're always grumpy and we're such a grumpy person and we're so unpleasant to be around. But that grumpiness is as ephemeral as this book in terms of all the conditions that have led to it. And in a few minutes' time, the conditions will be different and that state of mind will be different. So we ascribe a certain solidity to all our states of mind and our states of heart and to the stories that we tell ourselves. But they're all just conditioned. They all have just arisen in dependence upon this huge web of fragile conditions. And they will change in the next moment, and they will change in the next moment again, and they will change in the next moment again. Yeah. So I'm going to go into this a bit more now, but that's the main reason why the Buddha emphasized conditionality, that our states of mind, our states of heart, and our stories about the world are just really, really an attempt to ascribe a certain permanence to things that just isn't there. Because if any one of those conditions change, then the situation changes. So things just flow and change all the time, much more than we think they do. Yeah. So that brings us, if you haven't quite got that, don't worry, because the Buddha said that that's the main reason we're not enlightened, because we don't really get this fully. Yeah. So to bring out the implications a little bit more, I want to look at the second principle, and that is that all things change. Yeah, all things change. And again, this is something really, really obvious, but I'll come back to why that doesn't matter in a few minutes. So everything in the universe changes. There's nothing fixed. There's nothing beyond the process of change. The only thing that doesn't change is the fact that things change. Yeah. And even that change itself is always changing. Yeah. I remember my background is in theoretical physics, and I remember reading about theories of the universe, and we've probably all heard of the Big Bang, for example. And another theory that's out there is to complement the Big Bang is that there's a Big Bang. One of the big questions in physics is what happens? What will happen to the universe as time goes on? Will the universe keep expanding and thereby die of what they call a heat death, where things get so scattered that there's no longer any possibility for life? Or will it crash back down again into a point? And one theory of physics is that there'll be a Big Bang and a big crunch, then a Big Bang and a big crunch, and a Big Bang and a big crunch. Yeah. And so that's quite interesting, isn't it? Nothing ever staying the same. And if that feels nihilistic to you, I mean, the Buddhist response is that there's, again, you don't have to take this literally, but the traditional Buddhist view is that there's an infinite number of worlds. And with rebirth, you might die in this universe, but we were born in a very similar universe somewhere else that, so it's not like it means the end of all life or anything. But anyways, that's probably more than we need right now. The world around us is changing all the time. Our houses are changing, our gardens are changing, the weather is changing, the seasons are changing. Even a rock is changing when you look at it very closely. Our cars, our houses, our possessions, our books are constantly changing. So over the last few weeks, my book no longer like closes so neatly. It tends to fall open on certain pages as I read them. Hopefully the same is true of your books, I hope. It's becoming well worn and well read, so things change, and it'll never go back to the way it was when I first got it. And in a way, that's a good thing. Our bodies are changing, our bodies are always changing, and we're always, unfortunately, heading in one direction in terms of getting older. And according to some biologists, there are no living cells in your body that are there now that were there 7 years ago. Your body all the living cells in your body have been completely replaced. And there's no living cell in your body now that will be there in 7 years' time if you live that long. So your body, in terms of living cells, has been completely replaced every 7 years, continually replaced. So the patterns might stay the same, roughly, but even the patterns change, as you get older, maybe, your ears grow a bit longer and you look at, you get a few more wrinkles and things like this, So even the patterns themselves, which are kind of consistent, change as well. And your emotions are constantly changing. Your thoughts are constantly changing. And, are you the same person you were a few years ago? That's a really interesting reflection. Or have you changed? Are you? And one thing I do, we don't have time now for this. I often do this on the Buddhism courses, on the Intro to Buddhism course. Well, are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Are you the same person you were 5 years ago? And you reflect upon each of these, and then you come really closer. Are you the same person you were a month ago, a week ago, a day ago, an hour ago? And then you ask yourself, are you the same person you were a minute ago, 10 seconds ago, or even one breath ago, a moment ago? Are you the same person now that you were a breath ago? And when you go to sleep tonight, will you wake up the same person in the morning, or will there be change? Yeah. And there's always change. And the next part of that principle then, from the Buddha, which I'll just share again, and this won't be any surprise really, is that we're not okay with change. Yeah, we're so not okay with change. And part of the reason why we get blown around by the worldly winds is that we try to solidify things into something more solid, into something more permanent, into something more reliable, something of the world that's more reliable. So to be unenlightened is to not be okay with change. Yeah, that's what the Buddha is saying to us. And it's only when we're fully enlightened, when we fully let go of that tendency to try and solidify things to make them safe, that we'll be actually free and happy, truly free and truly happy. Yeah. Yeah. And I'll come back to that. So I'll just stop sharing again. Let's see, there's a question. And Maggie points out as well that the world would be awful if there was no change, because we would never change. Things would be utterly boring. It would be you wouldn't be a human being if there was no change. Yeah. But we do also resist change, and we're terrified of change. And a lot of Buddhist practice is about becoming more and more okay with change. Yeah. And our usual response is to get tight around things, to try and solidify things. You remember the fish basket that I talked about a few weeks ago that we pull over our heads to stay with what's familiar, to try and get some security in the face of life. And in a way, all of this sounds really kind of, it sounds really, sorry, let me just check something here. Yeah, all of this sounds really obvious in a way. But you'll remember what I said last time about our intellectual understandings and moving from intellectual understandings to emotional equivalence. Because we might think that we're okay with change, and we might understand that everything is changing, including ourselves. And then we'll go down and make a cup of tea for ourselves in the tea break, and we'll drop our favorite mug, and we'll get really upset because our favorite mug breaks, Or we'll go out to our car in the morning and find that someone has scratched it during the night, and we'll be really upset. Or we'll find another grey hair in our head, and we'll get really upset. So we might think we're okay with change, but a lot of the time we're not. And I think it's fine not to be okay with change. That's just what it means to be human. I think it's better to accept that than to not deny that. And what we do in response, like I've said, we try and see things as more fixed. We tend to see things as more fixed and more permanent than they are. One Buddhist writer I read talks about this as an optical delusion of consciousness. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but he talks about it as being an optical delusion of consciousness. So it's like an optical illusion, like a mirage, but it's actually an optical delusion that we buy into of consciousness, you could say. So we impute, we deeply believe, actually. It's not even that we think this, we deeply believe or want to believe, and thereby believe that we will never die, for example, or things will never leave us. And if we really deeply believe that things will never leave us, then we're going to be really blown around by gain and loss. We're going to be really blown around by gain and loss. Yeah, just to pick that one as an example. And Buddhism says that we cause ourselves all kinds of suffering by not being open to the flow of life, by not being open to this change. And one of the things about change, and people have been intimating this, is that, Maggie was saying this, without change, there's no beauty. Yeah. Like the reason, Buddhists often have flowers on the shrine is because there's a beauty to them because they're impermanent. Flowers are the more beautiful because they're more transient. If you had these beautiful flowers that just existed all the time, you'd totally take them for granted. You wouldn't notice them anymore. Yeah. In all likelihood. So impermanence leads to beauty as well. So I guess what the Buddha is trying to point out is that we try and solidify things. We make these stories about ourselves. And anytime we make a story about ourselves, we limit ourselves. Yeah. So if we have a story like, I'm only good at this, I'm no good at that, you're kind of closing down your ability to be good at lots of things, for example. Sometimes the story that you might have is, I'm a burden on people. People don't like me. And then if you have that story, you're closing down your own potential to connect with those people a bit more. Or even if you have a story like, I'm a really good person, even that can be problematic, because then you can not really want to acknowledge the times that maybe you're a bit more unkind, So it's better to, any stories, any labels we have, they are just temporary. I'll come back to this in a few moments, but whenever we have a story, it's like taking a photograph in 2 dimensions, say on a Polaroid, and you print out the Polaroid and you look at it and say, that's what it is, rather than the actual experience itself. Yeah. Any label is just like trying to freeze it into a photograph, a 2-dimensional photograph. And life is always more subtle than that. You can't pin anything down in life. You can have labels for things. You can have, you can say that, I am Vajrashura, and, I can see Irina there, so that's Irina, and they're useful labels to have. But we have to remember that just because I know that I'm called Vajrashura, it doesn't mean I know what Vajrashura is or I know what Irina is, as people, we're much more mysterious than that. And this is what Buddhism calls insubstantiality, that you can't pin anything down. Yeah, you can't pin anything down, really. And it's about being open to the mystery of life. Okay, and Oscar points out, Oscar, comment from Oscar there. Change can be unpleasant because we can be enjoying things. I think that's what you're saying. And Amy's asking, who is that quote from An Optical Delusion of Consciousness? I can't actually remember, Amy. I read it the other day. It was a reading. I'll get back to you about that, Amy. I can't actually remember who it was, but I know the reading, and I just can't think of it off the top of my head right now. Okay, so that's some of the principles. There's 1 or 2 more principles then here I want to talk about. So the next thing is then that we get lost in craving. We get lost in craving as a result. Now, craving is a rather kind of unpleasant word, but it's kind of what I mean by craving. And we often respond to the winds of change by getting lost in craving. So, it's that feeling of life gets complex, so you just reach for the chocolate. That's what I mean here. It was. Thanks, David. It was Einstein. You're right. Yeah, I knew it was from a Buddhism and Science course that I run. That optical delusion of consciousness. Well remembered, David. Unless you did a quick Google search. And So anyway, so our usual response to craving can be, the desire to get back under the blankets, our desire for chocolate to make it all feel okay. So to talk a little bit about craving, craving is where we're reaching out for something to take away something unpleasant, you might say. It's totally gain and loss, you could say, things like that. And when we're in a state of craving, we're doing a few things, okay? So what we're doing is we're telling ourselves a few stories about what we're craving, yeah? And it's important to say here, I'm talking about kind of unhelpful, more neurotic craving, yeah? Rather than, say, a healthy desire for freedom, or a healthy desire to meditate, for example, or a healthy desire to see your friend. I'm more talking about the neurotic end of things. So what we do when we're in craving is we tell ourselves an exaggerated story about the thing that we're craving. So we over-exaggerate the thing's pleasant aspect. Yes, we over-exaggerate the thing's pleasant aspect. We conceal the object's unpleasant aspects. And we exaggerate or overestimate its power to bring us happiness. Yeah. So let's say we think about having a nice bottle of wine. Yeah. We overemphasize the pleasure of what that bottle of wine will bring us because we've had a really hard week or whatever. We underestimate the pain and the headache and the stomach ache or whatever way it affects you, if it does affect you, the next day. And what a fool you've made by being drunk, if you could get really drunk. And also we think that it's going to solve all our problems. Yeah. So that's an example of how we distort a bottle of wine. Yeah. Or we think that if only we had the perfect romantic partner, we would be happy. And when we meet someone, there is nothing imperfect about them. I don't know if you know that initial phase of falling in love. Anything they do is perfect, and there is nothing that they can do wrong. And we think that if only we can have this person in our lives, we will be happy. And that might work for a short period of time. But then then you have to deal with all the other parts of them, as there inevitably is. So that's kind of what we do with craving. We distort how we see things. Yeah. And it's worth saying as well that not all our desires are cravings. So there's healthy desires, like I said. And craving is always bound up to some degree in a desire to shore up our identity. That's really, if you dig down into it, that's really what it's about. Trying to secure something that can't really ever be secured. We're trying to secure up the sense of self. Yeah. And it's just impossible. The only way, really, we have to have a self. We have to become a healthy, integrated self. But eventually we have to let go of the self then and allow it to be transparent to life. Anyway, so that's a bit more on craving. Let's see, will we do a bit more? Let's see the material. Hang on a second. I just wonder if we should just do a... there's a bit more on suffering, dissatisfaction. Hopefully it's not too grim for you tonight. But I think what we'll do is we'll stop now and just do a short reflection. I can move this stuff to the second half. So why don't we just do that little bit of reflection on change then? Because that would be no bad thing. And the reason we're looking at this is because we're not okay with change that we fall foul of the worldly winds, just to remind you of the context. So let's just sit up again in whatever way is comfortable. And when we're ready, then closing your eyes. And just tuning into the breath then. The breath in the belly in particular. And reflection is always embodied. It's always an embodied practice. So, keeping your awareness in your belly, if it's useful, if you want, you can put your hand on your belly if it's not already there. Just for 5 minutes or so, we'll just do that reflection I mentioned earlier. So cast your mind back to when you were younger, maybe when you were 15 or so, or another age around then. If don't pick a time that was too traumatic for you. And also have a sense of yourself here now, the person you are now. And looking at the person you were then. Are you the same person now as you were then? Obviously, there will be continuities, but are you the same person? With the same body, with the same views, with the same outlook, the same perspectives? And you don't have to do much more than that, just dwelling with that question. Reflection is all about staying with the questions rather than looking for answers. And bringing your mind back then to the person you were 10 years ago. And if you're under 25, you might want to do it for 5 years ago. So it's not the 15-year-old again. Or maybe halfway between 15 and where you are now. But let's just say 5 years ago. And again, just tuning into the flavor of what it was like to be that person 5 years ago. And also being in touch with how you are now. And are you the same person now as you were 5 years ago? I'm sure there are continuities, and there are also changes. And now bringing yourself back to the person you were 6 months ago. Back in December of last year. Without getting too much into the details of what your life was like then, asking yourself, are you the same person now as you were back then? Or has there been change? Are you the same person you were a week ago? Are you the same person tonight as you were yesterday? Or has there been change? Has your body changed? Has your mind changed? Have your mental states changed? Has your heart changed? And change just means change. It doesn't necessarily mean massive growth or development. It just means different. Are you the same person now as you were an hour ago when you first came to the class? Or do you feel different? It's good to be aware of your heart and your mind and how you're feeling as you're reflecting like this. Are you the same person now as you were when you started this reflection a few minutes ago? Are you the same person now as you were a moment ago? A breath ago? And if you notice you're holding on to anything for solidity or permanence, can we just gently let that go a little bit more? Trusting that if we're open to the flow of change, we'll feel freer. And then when we're ready, letting go of the practice and just sitting for a few moments. And then broadening out our attention once more, taking in the room, the sounds, introducing movement. And in your own time, opening your eyes again. Okay, so a little reflection on impermanence there. Hope that was okay. I find reflections like that quite freeing, but they can be a little unnerving as well. So, if anyone did have a wobble there, that's okay too. You can drop me a line as well if you need if you want. Great, thanks, Kat. So we're less permanent than we think we are. We're less solid than we think we are. And the more we can be open to change, the less we'll be blown around by the worldly winds. But it's hard to be open to change. So, that's why we encourage people to do meditation, and particularly the loving kindness meditation, so that we have that emotional warmth and resilience to be able to be open to change as well. Okay, so there was more I was going to say, but I'll leave it for the second half. So just a couple of small announcements. Firstly, we've one more week of this course, so next week will be the last week. And I've really enjoyed doing the course. I've really enjoyed being with you all and being on the team as well with the great team. But just to say that I'll be running a new course, another course rather, in, let me just double check the date now because I keep forgetting the date. In June, and that is called The Art of Reflection. So it's about how we reflect and how we think well and how we bring these intellectual understandings more down into our hearts. It'll be based upon another book, a really good book called The Art of Reflection, and it'll be a 5-week course starting on Monday nights from the 14th of June. So I'll include that in the email and the Slack channels if you want to have a look at that. And yeah, it's all about how to think well, how to reflect, how to give yourself space in order to turn things over about teachings that you hear. And it'd be lovely to have you all there. You're all very, very welcome. It's open to anyone, and you can bring friends of yours as well that are new. And I'm hoping that most of the team will be able to come on as well, so there'll be familiar faces there too. And I'll say more about that again. And then the other thing is just to remind you that the course has been done on a donation basis. So we're very much dependent upon your donations. So if you're in a position where you can give, we'd really ask if you can give. Giving is a core Buddhist practice and very, very good thing to do. And what you give will go towards helping us keep running courses like this, the art of reflection, all these other things. And, we're not going to be able to open in the next few months because the centre is closed, but we hope to open again in autumn. So we'll hopefully see many of you down there. Some of you might have to fly over from Tasmania and places like that in Canada, but, maybe we'll all meet in the centre somehow down the line. But do give if you can. Maybe Stephen, you can put the link in the chat there if people want to give. We're suggesting €100. We're suggesting for these kind of courses, like for a 5-week course, €100 if you can. But give as much or as little as you want, yeah. And if you've already given, a big thank you to you. And if you're not in a position where you can give anything, that's fine too, yeah. Okay. And then let's take a break. So maybe we could be back at 20 past, ready to go. That's 8 minutes time because we have a bit of material left to get through. So let's be back at 20 past. And in the tea break, you can put in any questions, and I'll put that Albert Einstein quote in as well for Amy and anyone else who wants it to. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, and then 1 or 2 other comments in the chat while we're waiting. A couple of people said that they noticed the commonalities as well as the differences, and that's great. There is commonalities. It would be foolish to deny that there are commonalities. So what I'd say then is that could be useful, but we will never have to worry about, how would I put it? The Dharma is a medicine. The Buddhist teachings is always method rather than doctrine. It's always about bending the straw back a different way. So when you do reflections on impermanence, it probably is more useful to look at the differences, to see that you're changing rather than how you stay the same, because you don't need to worry about not seeing commonalities or not seeing the sameness. You're always going to be working probably with trying to see the differences. So it might be better to focus on those, although in any one meditation, it might be quite rich to focus on the commonalities, but impermanence is usually about that. And then Rohanna asks about balancing the nature, living with a consciousness of change while still making commitments. There seems to be a danger in going too far one way or the other, and yet may be difficult to balance. So, I mean, I guess I just think back to the Buddha's life. The Buddha was utterly aware of change, and yet he founded this huge monastic, well, what we call now a monastic community, or a huge community of monks and nuns and lay followers who followed him. It was incredibly well organized. It had all these kind of guiding principles and rules about how they should and shouldn't behave. It had ways for them all to meet up. They were all very committed to living in certain ways, to following certain guidelines for living as a monk and a nun. So I don't think there's necessarily a conflict between being aware of change and having commitments. I think it's more the internal attitude that you have, that you make commitments, and at the same time, you know that everything is evolving as well. If we have committed to doing something like looking after someone, that's what you can commit to that with a sense of change. If you can bring in a sense of change, or if you can be more open, maybe a better way to put it is that there's always a flow. It's always a flow. And what we're trying to do is kind of control the river and stop it. But if you can go with the river flow, it's always better, and we can still have commitments. I'm sorry I can't really explain it better than that, Rohanna, but they're not really in conflict. And if they are, if you find that they are, then come and chat to me. Yeah. Amy, when looking at the no self doctrine in terms of no fixed and separate self. Oh, okay, Rohanna, it'll be in the recording anyway. I can't actually remember what I said if I was going to repeat it. Amy, when looking at the no self doctrine in terms of no fixed self separate to others, you look at it through change, but also through interconnection. Yeah. There's lots of different ways of looking at no self, which is another word for insubstantiality. So the main way I look at it myself is that because everything is changing so much, you can't put any fixed label onto things. And I think that's the most helpful way of looking at no self. It's not saying we don't have an experience of self. It's more that there's no fixed self. So I think Buddhism, sometimes you read Buddhist books and they talk about no self doctrine. I think that's unhelpful sometimes. It can be experienced in a nihilistic way. So what it's saying is that there's nothing fixed about ourselves. I mean, to say that there's no self would be foolish. And actually, sometimes the Buddha taught that there is a self because it was more useful to think in terms of that, in those terms. But what the Buddhist teaching on insubstantiality is that there's nothing you can pin down about the self. There's nothing fixed about the self. It's ever flowing and ever changing. And I think in the West, we need to be very careful of a more nihilistic approach where we just see negation when we hear no self. So what it's saying is there is a self, but it's ever flowing, it's ever changing. And I think in some ways, people would be better off believing in a really positive self than jumping straight to no self, if that answers your question, Amy. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, this is a whole lot of other material that is all to do. It's all wisdom teachings from Buddhism. So, and then a follow-up comment from Amy: would interconnection be from a different teaching from no self? Then, the Buddha never talked about interconnectedness. Actually, it's not to say that interconnectedness is wrong, but it's just not a term that he would have used because I don't know if the term was around back then. Just like, Sangharakshita, who founded our community, talks about evolution, and we can see it as an evolution of consciousness. But the Buddha would have never used the word evolution because they had no idea. They didn't have a word for it, basically. But I'm not sure about what school it would be. It might be a more modern phenomenon, but I think interconnection is a useful way of thinking about what might be called no self. But let's just leave no self aside and think in terms of insubstantiality. So one of the strongest lessons I learned of insubstantiality is just how deeply interconnected one is with loved ones when they die. So I remember when my father was dying, I never realized just how much he was part of me, and I felt like I'd lost an arm that I never knew I had. So I think that, and it was very painful, obviously. I can talk about it now without any problems, but it was very painful. But it was a real lesson for me in interconnectedness. And that's what I think insubstantiality means, that we overlap much, much more than we think we do. We're so much more interdependent. The conditions for me being me are you, you know what I mean, and all the people around me. So that's what I think interconnectedness means, Amy. Okay, I better keep going. I'm glad I asked for some questions, and it's great to get them. Interconnectedness and insubstantiality and impermanence, they're at the heart of the mystery of life, it must be said. Yep. And they're things that we need to reflect upon more. So come on my reflection course and we'll reflect upon them more. Yeah. So the next thing then to say, and I'll say this a bit briefly. Now, where's my, there it is. Okay, so I wanted to talk then, because we're not okay with impermanence, because we're not okay with interconnectedness or insubstantiality, we experience what the word is dukkha. Yeah, and I'll talk about this briefly. So dukkha, I mentioned this before, but it translates as dissatisfaction, unsatisfactoriness, suffering even, yeah? And there's 3 types or 3 levels. So the first one is physical suffering. So this is just having a body, yeah? You have a body, you get sick sometimes, you bang your toe off the door, you get a headache, There's not really much you can do about this. Yeah, there's not really much you can do. It's kind of like the first arrow, you could say, that we looked at the previous week. Above and beyond that suffering is, or a deeper suffering then, is psychological suffering. And this is twofold. It's usually to do with the fear of losing what we have, or the fear of being brought together with what we don't want. Yeah, so you might be worried on that, that you're going to end up having to sit beside someone you don't like, for example, or talk to someone you really despise. Or you might be worried about you might have a fear of losing what you have, and you might fear losing what you really value, like some of your possessions or your loved ones. Or you might even, at a more subtle level, fear the ending of the pleasure you're experiencing right now, And a very simple example of that is, as I mentioned before, planning the next chocolate before you've even halfway through the chocolate in your mouth, And this causes us suffering, if only the suffering of not actually tasting the chocolate that we have in our mouth. And I think a lot of life can be like that. We're so fixated on prolonging the good that we actually don't enjoy it anymore. I remember being on holidays one time, I think I said this before, and planning how nice it would be to be on my holidays the following year, and things like that. And it just took me away from being here right now. So that's a more psychological suffering, you could say. There's a lot more that could be said about that. And then the third level is more existential or spiritual suffering. And even if everything else is right, even if the porridge is just right, the bed is just at its most comfortable, even if, the sun is shining, we get our vaccination, the world becomes normal again, there will still be some part of us that knows that on its own terms, the world can't make us happy. Yeah, no matter how perfect our house is, our relationships are, there's always some part of us that longs for something more. It's just part of being human. It's part of having a heart. It's part of having a mind. Yeah, and this is like the existential itch that's always there underneath it all. And the only thing that meets that itch, the only thing that meets that level of dukkha, is the truth. Is realizing the truth for ourselves. Is the Buddhist, and for me, the most clear vehicle for that is the Buddhist teachings, although lots of different teachings have this taste of freedom and meaning in them. So I think it's that search for meaning that meets us at this level. Yeah. And I think in the West, what we have is we've a lot of, we've a lot less physical suffering thanks to health and medicine. We've a lot more psychological suffering because we get neurotic about things, and there's an awful lot of existential suffering. And I think most people, why they come to the Buddhist Centre, it might be stress and it might be psychological, but by the end of a course, it's usually the more existential level of things. That's where the solutions are really to be found. Yeah. And if you find the solutions at the existential level, they filter back down into the psychological. It's a bit funny. I don't know how to explain it any more than that, but you can try that out for yourself. When there's meaning in your life, you're less worried about losing what you have. Yeah, for example. So I think this is a useful system as well. I just thought I'd mention that. And again, if there's any questions on that, just let me know. Okay. So then the next thing I want to focus, I haven't got much more content, but again, I just wanted to say a bit more about the nature of existence and the Buddhist teachings. Hopefully I'm not giving you spiritual indigestion now with all this material, but so we've talked about the worldly winds. We've talked about pleasure and pain. We've talked about fame and infamy. We've talked about praise and blame. We've talked about gain and loss. And Vajragupta in his book talks about another Buddhist teaching, which is called the Three Obsessions. It pops up in various places in the Pali Canon. It's a different version of greed, hatred, and delusion, basically. But the teaching is that pleasure and pain and fame and infamy, they're kind of preoccupied with craving. Yeah. So we want this, we don't want that. We want fame, we want pleasure, we don't want pain. I've actually done those wrong. I'm sorry. So actually it should be pleasure and pain and gain and loss. My apologies for that. I'll have to change that later on. So just move gain and loss over in the place of fame and infamy. My apologies for that. I spent so long doing the colors and everything, I forgot to check the actual thing. But anyways, so craving is part of pleasure and pain and gain and loss. Craving underlies pleasure and pain and gain and loss. And that's the first obsession. We get obsessed with craving. The second one then is conceit. So conceit is about, traditionally in Buddhism, conceit is where you compare yourself to someone else in any way. So if you compare yourself as being better than, or worse than, or even equal to another person in anything. That's conceit. Yeah. And it's an unhelpful state of mind. So you might not have come across this before, but it's really, really interesting, I think, that Buddhism says there's no point in comparing yourself as being better than, worse than, or even equal to another person. And I think for me, the reason for this is that it comes back to this whole thing of insubstantiality, that we're just so mysterious. It's just such an ever-changing flow that for me to compare myself to you or you to compare yourself to them, it just doesn't compute in a way. We're just all so different. And it might be useful to say, well, look, that person's meditating every day, so I'm going to meditate every day. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about something different. We're relating our sense of ourselves to other people in an unhelpful way. And in this one then comes praise and blame and fame and infamy. Again, apologies for the incorrect diagram, yeah? And that's the second obsession that we have, or the second thing underlying the worldly winds. So there's craving, there's conceit. And then underlying all of this then is ignorance. Ignorance about the basic fact that we think by playing the worldly winds we will be happy. We think by getting this and not having that we'll be happy. By having as much as we can of the positive one and pushing away as much of the negative one of each pair of the worldly winds, we'll be happy. So it's maybe obsession here is a bit more, isn't quite the right word, but these are the kind of driving forces. There's craving, there's conceit, and there's ignorance underlying it all. So our ignorance basically is that we just see things really incorrectly. That's what ignorance means in Buddhism. So we need to correct this. We need to correct this by becoming wise. And this is the last thing I'll say then, and we'll go into groups for a while. So how we correct this then is we follow the threefold path to wisdom, the threefold path to freedom to wisdom. And we've been doing this already now. We've been doing all these three things. So the first step is ethics. Now you might say, well, we haven't been doing ethics, have we? But this is simply how we act in the world, yeah? And in Buddhism, something is ethically positive if it aligns with reality, yeah? So do the ways that we act agree with impermanence? Do we act as if we know things change all the time, yeah? And so on. So that's what we've been doing, particularly in week 2, when we've been looking at, recognizing the worldly winds, trying to, not act upon them, trying to recognize them, trying to instead go through the Dharma doorway, trying to let go of the stories that we tell ourselves. So that's all in the realm of ethics. Yeah. The second level, the second of the threefold path is meditation, and all these overlap as well. And meditation is about creating the space that we need to see things clearly, noticing the stories again we tell ourselves and dropping them. So hopefully you've had a taste of how meditation that we looked at last week can help create the space to see through the worldly winds and to have a bit of relief from them. And then the third one of the threefold path is wisdom. And this is like through the reflections that we've been doing, through all the material we've been looking at tonight. And really what wisdom is about is where we start to shift deeper patterns of being. We start to, it's less, something new emerges, a new awareness emerges. And it's not that we have to force anything anymore. It's like something has seeped into our bones, you could say, after practicing ethics and meditation and reflecting a lot. And instead we kind of intuitively live more and more in tune with change and in tune with insubstantiality and in tune with conditionality and so on. And we suffer less as a result. So this is the threefold path. And again, this goes right back to the Buddha, how we behave in terms of ethics, deliberately training the mind in terms of meditation, and then uprooting and changing deep patterns of behavior, which is wisdom. Yeah, so that's the threefold path. And by doing this at each stage in different ways, we're less and less blown around by the worldly winds. We're less and less blown around by the worldly winds, yeah? Okay, so what we'll do, let's see, what time are we now? Let's actually one more thing. Let me just think for a second. Okay, let's just look at the home practice then for the week. So the home practice this week. So read chapter 4 of the book. Yeah, read chapter 4 of the book. This is about all this stuff, and he does it a little differently. I've covered quite a bit of his material, but I've also brought in my own. So there is other stuff to read in the book as well. He has a lovely section about waiting for Godot, which is he feels Beckett's illustration of the true nature of existence. And thankfully, we don't just stop there. We have the Buddha to point out a more immediate remedy as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in chapter 4 of the book. And then continue to work with the worldly winds. Yeah, continue to work. That is your home practice for the rest of your life, really. Look at your ethics, look at your actions. Remember those 4 things from week 2, particularly the Dharma doors and recognizing the worldly winds. Meditate every day. Keep meditating. And then in terms of wisdom, notice the impermanence of the winds and notice the ever-changing nature of the stories we tell ourselves and the ever-changing nature of our own minds and our own hearts. Yeah, I think impermanence is the easiest of the 3 of those: impermanence, insubstantiality, and suffering. It's the easiest one in some ways to grasp, but use any of them. But I think impermanence is a good one. And then let us know how you're getting on Slack. Yeah, let us know how you're getting on Slack. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is we'll do a very short reflection for just 5 minutes, and then we'll go into the groups. So why don't we set ourselves up and we'll just do a very brief reflection on the impermanence of the worldly winds, yeah? And this reflection, a fuller version of this reflection, is in the end of the chapter for this week. So you can do that as well this week. So I want you just to cast your mind back to this week and think of a time when you're really caught up in one of the pairs of worldly winds. So it could be gain and loss. It could be fame and infamy. It could be praise and blame. It could be pleasure and pain. And again, remembering to breathe down into your belly as you do this. And now I want you to see if you can notice the impermanence of the positive one of the pair. Maybe reminding yourself that it didn't last, or it won't last, or it doesn't last. And see what happens. See what effect that has on you. And now focusing on the negative one of the pair, the one you don't tend to like, and just see how that is impermanent too. Did it last? Is it still there, or is it likely to last if you're still in it? And see if that has any effect on you. And now bring these reflections together and consider the impermanence of both the positive and the negative of the pair of the worldly wind. So they both arise and pass away. They're both impermanent. They both change. And being with the fact that both of these change, be open to whatever effect that has on us. And then when we're ready, bringing the practice to a close, letting go of the reflection, broadening out our attention once more. And when you're ready, coming out of the reflection and opening your eyes. So that was a little shorter than I'd like it to be, but you can do the full reflection again yourself from the book during the week. So what we'll do now, Stephen, if you could send us into groups for 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, and we'll have a chance to set our intentions for the week. And then we'll come back and we'll have a couple of last minutes then if there's any questions and so on. So whenever you're ready, Stephen, if you want to send us into the groups. So Stephen can send us straight in this time, I think. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for tonight. So you have your home practice, read the book, continue to work with the worldly winds, continue to meditate, watch your actions, reflect upon things. You've plenty to do. If there's too much to do, just focus on being mindful, and meditating. And if you're mindful in a way, you'll notice all these other things as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to stay on and you can ask questions. If you want to talk more about no self or anything like that, it's a juicy topic. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes. And otherwise, we'll see you next week for the final week of the course. And what we'll be covering next week is the 5th chapter of the book, where Vajrashura looks at particularly Western winds, Western in the sense of, like, you could say European, American, Western cultural winds that we're blown about by, that maybe the Buddha didn't have to think about very much. So we'll look at that, and we'll also look at finishing out the course next week. And I'll email you with all the details and put them in the Slack as well. So we'll leave it there. So see you next week. And if you want to stay on, I'll just turn on the ability to unmute yourself now, and you can ask a question. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.